Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, August 27th. 2 weeks from today, the Schiller Institute will be having a conference which is called Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. This will be a 2-day conference, September 10th and 11th, and we'll say more about this once we get into the body of our discussion today. At that conference and on the course of the week going up to the conference, we will be emphasizing the proposal that has been a continuous proposal made by LaRouche, that there be a new security and development architecture created worldwide. And in specific, she has called for what she calls an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system. And the graphic that we're showing there indicates what we are calling the World Land Bridge, also called the New Silk Road by others. But the concept is peace comes through development, economic development of advanced technologies, advanced industrial systems, and a world health system. What we want to do is to open, and we have a sort of a special guest with us throughout today, and that is Lyndon LaRouche, the late Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman. But with respect to this idea of the new Bretton Woods system, this was something that was discussed by Lyndon LaRouche many times over many years. What we're going to show here to begin is a short a clip of his description of how it is that such an idea of such a system should come into existence. And what I think you want to think about is, what if this man were now the President of the United States, or had been the President of the United States?
The first step has to be to bring a group of nations together to agree to put the old system into bankruptcy reorganization. That is, the world system. That doesn't mean we go into other countries which may not subscribe to this meeting, this conference, and tell them they're going to do that internally. No, we don't tell them that. We say, we're going to do it. The United States and its partners are going to do it in terms of their relationship. Now, the nations I've listed as the candidates for this kind of cooperation are led by China, Russia, India, some part of Europe, and hopefully we'll get a government in Germany which can pull itself together and play a key role as the keystone nation of Western continental Europe, as a partner with the U.S. in cooperation for the development of Asian countries and the rebuilding of Russia. Asian countries such as China, India, Pakistan, Iran, Malaysia, and so forth. Countries that are indicated they would like such a system of cooperation, particularly if it's backed by a group of nations which represents the majority of the human race, which represents the predominant power on this planet. If you take the United States with our friends in South America, our friends in Africa, our friends in continental Europe, our friends in Russia, our friends in China, our friends in other parts of Asia, our friends presumably in Japan will come along with us on this one. That is power. There is no greater power on this planet than such a combination. If we decide that our relationships with one another and the relationships we offer jointly and individually to other countries are going to be based on the new system, I guarantee you the old system is finished at that moment and a new system will start immediately.
Now, obviously, given the present leadership of the United States, in fact, the leadership of the United States over the past 25 or so years, that proposal coming from the United States seems like a complete impossibility. And certainly the notion that Russia, China are the primary allies of the United States in the building of such a new world would seem to be completely impossible to create. That, nonetheless, is precisely why the conference is called Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. Because that crisis is the folly that exists in the corridors of power in the transatlantic sector, as the world is faced with the inevitable necessity to transition to a higher economic development platform for humanity as a whole. Now, instead of that, we have a commitment to something very, very different. We have a commitment to a kind of march of folly, sort of like Napoleon's army or Napoleon's Persian horde is more like it, heading toward Moscow, invading Russia over the period from June through September of 1812. And no matter what you tried to tell Napoleon, you could not dissuade him from going to his own doom, convinced that he was marching to victory. We have exactly that process presently underway with what's going on globally, especially around the so-called Ukraine-Russia conflict, which does not exist. There's a conflict between two opposing systems, the system of oligarchy and the system of republican sovereign nation states, not so-called autocracies versus democracies. That is not the primary division in the world today. And the question is, can the people of the United States, the people of the transatlantic sector, give up or force their nations to give up the axioms that are leading us to that kind of doom? I want to have us go right into our discussion. We have with us Harley Schlanger. He hasn't been with us for several weeks. And what Harley is going to do is try to set the stage for what's going to be an interesting dialogue. I don't think it's sort of one of those surprise shows. He doesn't know what's going to come after he speaks, but we have him, we'll have him in a dialogue with his and my old friend Lyndon LaRouche shortly, after he lays the stage for us all to deliberate on a level that allows us to maybe address this question in a different way than you might have thought you were when you first turned this program on. So, Harley, welcome and take it away.
Well, thanks, Dennis, and good to be back with you after a brief respite. This question of Lyndon LaRouche's role is one that even people in our own organization sometimes don't have as a clear a picture as we should. And it's largely due to the fact that LaRouche, as a figure of controversy, was not controversial in what he said. If you actually look at the course of human history, you'll find precedents for the ideas of LaRouche in the great moments of Renaissance in various cultures. The Socrates, Plato, Aeschylus period in ancient Greece, the alliance, de facto alliance of people like Nicholas of Cusa, Leonardo da Vinci, later Kepler and Leibniz, the German classical period, the founders of the American Republic. There were moments where figures emerged who were able to present ideas that were outside of what was accepted. And through the force of those ideas, the power of those ideas, and the collapse of the system they were addressing, those ideas managed to take hold. They were not ideas accepted by the whole population, but where you have leadership that can take these kinds of axiomatically revolutionary ideas and present them, you have the possibility of the average citizen rising to a higher level, especially when the alternative is destruction of what they know as security and living standards. Now, we're at such a moment today, what we're calling the greatest crisis in history, characterized by a systemic collapse of the financial system globally. There are some exceptions, and we'll talk about those, but in general, the financial system as a whole is heading down the drain. We're seeing it in terms of shortages. They call them supply chain shortages, but these are just an ephemeral aspect of the economic policies of globalization in the form of neoliberalism, which has destroyed the physical economy in the most advanced countries of the world, the transatlantic countries, and has made us dependent in those countries on a supply chain of cheap labor, cheap raw materials, in some cases slave labor, which could not possibly last. At the same time, as we see nations beginning to move away from that, we see something very interesting, which is that there's, on the one hand, this fake counterposition that Dennis identified, this idea of the summit for democracy, that you have the democracies on the one side that support the so-called rules-based order, which are the rules of the City of London and Wall Street. But now you have emerging, actually quite fast, since February 4th, a new system, an alternative system, centered around the meeting on February 4th of President Putin and President Xi Jinping, but which had been in motion over a number of years. And the figure of Lyndon LaRouche is part of this history in the most profound way. There's, in a sense, a 50-year arc of LaRouche's interventions going back to August 15th, 1971, when the decision was made to scrap the Bretton Woods system of Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't scrapped all at once, and some of it had been scrapped before that, going back to the period after the assassination of President Kennedy, because President Kennedy reflected a link to the Roosevelt tradition, and his assassination opened the door for two policy directions which are responsible today for the systemic collapse, namely the emergence of so-called radical environmentalism of green policy, wedded to neoliberal economics, that is deregulation, privatization, and so on. And LaRouche was the one person who not only saw this and saw the connection between it, and wrote and lectured extensively about it over many, many years, but at the same time, he understood what the alternative was. And as he became more effective in reaching people, and by people I mean average citizens, through our street organizing, our campaigns, but also heads of state, he met with a number of national and international leaders to present his ideas. And he became an increasing focus as well of the individuals who are pushing the green agenda, the neoliberal agenda, and what became known later as the neoconservative agenda of a unipolar world order. LaRouche became a thorn in their side, as they admitted in their rare moments of candor. For example, in 1982, when Henry Kissinger wrote a letter to then FBI Director William Webster, asking him to meet with his attorney to discuss what can be done about the LaRouche organization. And that began the most, well, I would say the biggest, dirtiest Get LaRouche task force ever. At one time, including people like William Weld from the Justice Department, who later became the Rhino Republican, the Liberal Republican, or the Bush Republican governor of Massachusetts, and also Robert Mueller, who was part of the Boston side of the Get LaRouche task force in the mid to late 1980s. These networks targeted LaRouche. They targeted him with lies and slanders, but they also targeted him by what we know today as cancel culture. They made the policy that you cannot discuss LaRouche unless you're calling him names. You don't have to prove what you're saying about him because you couldn't prove it. The idea that LaRouche was a Nazi or a communist or an anti-Semite was made up out of pure hot air. There's no evidence, no statements for him, nothing that would indicate that those were true. But the other side of it was by canceling him, by not letting people hear what he had to say. The only time people heard him was when we were able to raise enough money to put him on national television during his presidential campaigns. And in those moments, there were spikes of support for him. In 1986, when two LaRouche candidates won statewide Democratic primaries in Illinois. In 1988, when we won the Harris County in Texas Democratic Party chairmanship. We had many candidates in Democratic primaries getting between 30 and 45% of the vote without any honest press coverage, but just by the power of the ideas of LaRouche and our ability to go out to the public and present them. Now, if you look at this 50-year arc of history, look at some of the stunning forecasts LaRouche made, stunning because they were seemingly, no one else was saying it, but they turned out to be completely accurate, starting with his warning in 1971 that breaking up the Bretton Woods system would lead to a dissolution eventually of the dollar system and a collapse of the productive economies of the Western world. He followed this up with a discussion of why this was what he called Schachtian fascism, the looting of the population, of looking for cheap labor, cheap raw materials, the same way Hjalmar Schacht provided that for the Hitler war machine. You look at the other economic forecasts he made, I'll just reference a couple of them. August 2007, when he warned of a collapse of the banking system because of the mortgage-backed security policy. A year later, that happened. Other forecasts, strategic forecasts, his work with the Reagan administration on the Strategic Defense Initiative was one example where his ideas, his work behind the scenes ended up suddenly in the public eye when Ronald Reagan spoke of the Strategic Defense Initiative in a March 23, 1983 national telecast. LaRouche's January 2001 warning of a Reichstag fire event, which would be used for emergency decree to suppress opposition to the policies of the George W. Bush administration. Less than 9 months later, there was 9/11 and the Patriot Act and the beginning of the escalation of the police state. So you can go through this, and we have done this in the Executive Intelligence Review, reviewing his forecasts. I want to just catch up on a couple today to show that even after his death, he died in February 2019, his ideas are at the center of discussions, both of his enemies, who are continuing to try to crush the LaRouche movement. And in doing so, they're having to crush more and more governments that are moving toward the ideas of LaRouche, but also support emerging. This idea of a Eurasian century or the Asian century, which is something LaRouche was talking about in the 1990s, around the potential of China and Russia and India. But LaRouche always emphasized not just China, Russia, and India. For it to work, it should include the United States. Because if those four powers work together, you would have the economic power to defeat the forces of the City of London and Wall Street, which were operating on the basis of a neoliberal globalization. What people today focus on is the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and Davos. That was already there in the 1980s, the 1990s. There was something called the 1980s Project that was part of the Jimmy Carter administration that LaRouche exposed. The Trilateral Commission that LaRouche exposed around the George H.W. Bush networks. All of these things have been there, but they've tended to have their way in terms of shaping international policy. Now, just to catch you up to a couple of things from today, there's the annual Kansas City Federal Reserve Conference going on in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And what they're talking about is nonsense. Everyone was focused on Jerome Powell's speech. And what did he say? We're going to need to have some pain to deal with inflation. Well, who's going to have the pain? Not the people who pay Powell's salary, not the people who run the Federal Reserve, namely the private banks, which are for the most part bankrupt and holding on to trillions of dollars of worthless financial assets in the form of derivatives, international trading operations. They're the ones who should feel the pain. They should be put through what LaRouche called bankruptcy reorganization. Instead, by raising interest rates supposedly to combat inflation, they're going to be taking more and more out of the hide of the population killing the developing sector and out of the so-called middle class and working class families in the advanced sector. So I want to just go back to the last moment of a Jackson Hole, Wyoming conference where this policy that's now called the Great Reset was put into place. And it was done through a network that included BlackRock's Larry Fink. It included Mark Carney, who at the time was the governor of the Bank of England. It included networks that are well known, like J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America's Moynihan, and others. And what did they talk about in August 2019? Remember, this is before COVID, and this is before the Russian special military operations in Ukraine. They were talking about the problems they were having protecting the debt in the corporate sector. And this came to a head shortly after the Jackson Hole, Wyoming summit in August 2019, in the middle of September, when it turned out that the banks were no longer willing to make short-term overnight loans called repo loans to enable their corporate clients to have cash to cover their immediate debt. The banks no longer were willing to do it, even though the interest rates for that had gone up to close to 10%. In other words, they could make money doing it, but what they feared was a chain reaction of defaults. And so as a result, they opted out. At that point, the Federal Reserve stepped in with trillions of dollars of fresh quantitative easing money. And this is what was the subtext of that August 2019 Jackson Hole, Wyoming summit. How to move to a new system where the central banks not only control the monetary and credit policy, but fiscal policy, spending policy, because that's the essence of the Great Reset, giving the technocrats who represent the interests of the private banks, the bankrupt private banks, giving them the power over and above national governments to make spending policy for nations. And this was absolute proof of what LaRouche had presented more than 20 years earlier, called the triple curve theory. Now, his triple curve was based on, and I hope we'll get it up on the screen in a second, the relationship between financial aggregates, monetary aggregates, and physical economic input-output. And what LaRouche argued is that as the financial aggregates were going up, which is basically various forms of credit, or more correctly, debt, the bets that were being made on stocks, on bonds, on new financial instruments, as the volume of those aggregates were increasing, the Federal Reserve and the central banks had to increase the monetary aggregates to provide the liquidity to keep rolling over the bad debt. In doing that, the third function of an economy, that is the investment in physical economic input-output, was slowly disintegrating or ending to the point that it became gradually cut off. And you see that the blue line, the third curve, a dramatic drop in investment in those areas which are necessary for physical economic growth, including research and development, including infrastructure, including new plant and equipment, including education and raising of living standards. That curve collapsed, and the banks instead protected the two upper curves. And what LaRouche said is that ultimately this will reach a point of a hyperbolic effect and will collapse the whole system. And that's what we're seeing today. The post-2019 policy of quantitative easing poured huge volumes of liquidity into a bankrupt system. But that bankrupt system was not solvent, could never be solvent, largely because the more new quantitative easing money you were pouring into it, the greater the total debt. And at certain points, there wasn't even enough money to service, enough profit in corporations, I should say, to service the debt, the interest on the debt that they had. And that's why we've been on this super inflation curve since September 2019. Now, just a couple of aspects of this. You have in the United Kingdom a prospective inflation rate of 18% by the end of this year. You have the discussion of what is now called fuel poverty, which is people not being able to afford heating, oil, or the gas and electricity needed for cooking and so on. You have strikes going on in some of the ports in the United Kingdom. Again, the supply chain is affected. In Germany, the government is talking about taxing the population up to 2,000 euros above the high costs of energy between October and March to offset the cost to the government of providing some energy. But they're also forecasting the danger of blackouts and brownouts. And industries are already shutting down in Germany. Now, this is not because of what Vladimir Putin decided to do to protect Russia's national security in Ukraine. This has to do with the green agenda, the destruction of an energy grid based on efficient and adequate amounts of energy flux density coming from modern coal, oil and gas, and nuclear. The German green agenda is to cut all of that out and replace it with solar and wind, which it's now clear does not provide enough electricity to keep an industrial economy going. And so we're seeing the effects of green policy, which LaRouche warned about in the 1960s and 70s, and neoliberal economic policy coming together to create a confluence of a systemic collapse. Now, at the same time, you have the insistence coming from those establishment figures who run the United States government and the NATO countries, the insistence that every other country stick to that the Paris Accord, the agreements from Glasgow, and so on, for a net zero carbon economy must be kept. And there's a rebellion against that. At the same time, these countries are saying, we are not giving in to your demands that we give up our sovereignty. As the South African foreign minister said directly to Tony Blinken when he tried to lecture her about why South Africa should stop supporting Russia and then stop working with Russia, should join the sanctions against Russia. She said, you can't bully us, we're a sovereign nation. And a growing number of nations in the developing sector are acting on that principle of sovereignty, that they have a right, a responsibility to defend the living standards of their population. That's why they're elected. And they're not going to give in to the bullying from the US and NATO, even though they've seen the US and NATO carry out regime change and coups and launch civil wars and destructive wars, as in Iraq, as in Afghanistan, as in Libya, to governments that don't go along with Blinken's revered rules-based order. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. This is not about the freedom of the Ukrainian people. If the United States was concerned with the freedom of the Ukrainian people, they never would have sponsored the coup in the Maidan Square in February 2014. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this that's emerged recently is that Lyndon LaRouche remains a bone of contention for the people who are pushing these policies that are putting the world into bankruptcy and on the verge of war. And one of the best examples of that is the targeting of members of the LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, as well as a large number of people who are cooperating and collaborating with us in dialogue with us to discuss the establishment of a new financial and security architecture. A group called the Committee to Combat Disinformation put out a list on July 14th of either 72 or 78 people who they said are information terrorists who should be brought before war tribunals as war criminals. And on that list were over 30 people who had participated at Schiller Institute conferences, including a number of people that many of you are familiar with, such as Ray McGovern, such as Colonel Richard Black, I think Jim Jatras, but also prominently Helga Zepp LaRouche, Diane Sayre, who's the candidate for Senate in New York State, and me. We've been added to that list as a sign of a continuing fear, not by the Ukrainians, but the people who are running the Ukraine war, coming from British intelligence primarily, but also the State Department, the U.S. State Department, and intelligence agencies that recognize LaRouche's ideas, not just in the exposure of the neo-Nazi elements of the Ukrainian government and armed forces and security forces, but LaRouche's ideas as the counter to the global rules-based order. They see the vision of LaRouche in the Eurasian development taking place around the Belt and Road Initiative, around the integration of Russia and China and the areas in between, the rejection by governments such as Pakistan and India, Nigeria, South Africa, of the International Monetary Fund demands for austerity in order to protect the bankrupt financial system. These are ideas that have been out there for this 50-year period from LaRouche. And so it's not surprising that something like the Committee to Combat Disinformation would be targeting LaRouche, putting out what Scott Ritter called a kill list, a hit list. Now, when Ritter said that, it turned out to be absolutely prescient, given what happened last Saturday with the car bombing murder of Daria Dugin, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, a Russian philosopher. Now, the Western media keeps saying Dugin was Putin's brain, but if you actually investigate it, you find that Dugin and Putin never met. They had no relationship. And this is a concoction from Western media, not surprising. But what isn't a concoction is that Dugin and his daughter were on a list of something called the neoconservative, which is a targeting operation inside the Ukrainian security forces. And on their new list, their current list, are 4 people who are not Russians or in Ukraine, 4 people who, again, are participants in a dialogue about the Ukraine war that's not accepted by the State Department and the mainstream media. They include Tulsi Gabbard, who so far has not participated with us, but you never know, Ray McGovern, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and me, on the same list as Daria Dugina. Now, we're going to have an extensive article in the next issue of the Executive Intelligence Review about the background to this organization, what it represents, how it has targeted people in the past. There are at least 4 Ukrainian opposition figures who were targeted on this list previously, all of whom ended up dead. 3 were shot to death, and 1 supposedly committed suicide. So this is something that has to be taken seriously in the same way that the intention of the Get LaRouche task force was to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche, if necessary by assassination, as on the massive raid of October 6, 1986, but the continuing efforts to silence the LaRouche movement. And this is the most recent example of that. Now, I am covering this because we have this conference coming up on September 10th and 11th. And the theme of the conference is this question of how to inspire people to act in a moment of great crisis using the method and ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. It will be coinciding with a commemoration of the 100th birthday. LaRouche would have turned 100 and just days before this conference. And it will give us an opportunity, as Dennis has said we're going to do in the rest of this presentation this afternoon, to look at the ideas of LaRouche, to see how far ahead he was of everyone else, and why he was such a threat to the established system of an oligarchy, which was intent on imposing its global control as a global dictatorship over any nation, over any people. And it's LaRouche's ideas that not only live on, but are an inspiration to those governments who are standing up for the interests and rights of their population. And so I think it's urgent for people in the Western world in particular to break through the attempt to cancel this historic figure, Lyndon LaRouche, which is not working, but break through on your own to discover his ideas, to engage your mind with his mind, and to enter into a dialogue with LaRouche in the same way that LaRouche introduced to people like myself and Dennis his ongoing dialogue with figures of the past, such as Plato, such as Cusa, such as Friedrich Schiller, and others. That dialogue is the threat, the dialogue with leaders and intellectual giants of the past, as well as the dialogue among cultures today. That's the target of the NATO forces. That's the target of the U.S. State Department. When the list naming us was released on July 14th, there were officials from non-governmental organizations and U.S. government organizations in the audience. They know that this list is a kill list and that there are Americans on this list, and they have refused to do anything about it. So I would urge you to go to this week's, the coming issue of the Executive Intelligence Review to get the background of this operation, but also register for our conference and take the time between now and September 10th to introduce yourself to the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, or if you already know some of the ideas, to get into a new, vigorous dialogue with LaRouche in your mind to prepare yourself for this conference. So that's what I wanted to present for the beginning of this discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Harley. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue on the theme that you were concluding with by just talking about something here. As Harley indicated, there is this large-scale operation. It's not just in Ukraine, by the way. It's the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation was the initial entity that was tasked with beginning the attempt to do the suppression. But what this has led us to is a certain kind of intelligence job that we are going to do. But we also, in order to be able to do that job, in order to be able to actually act against the people that would try to suppress the right to deliberate of American citizens, up to the point of and including even violence, it's necessary to say a few things and to give people a sense of how this operates. Now, there was a conversation that Scott Ritter, and so people realize he was formerly the IAEA weapons inspector, that in the first Iraq war was charged with going in the early 90s, we're talking about, to Iraq to determine whether there were weapons of mass destruction. And he determined that not only were there not any such weapons, but that in fact his own agency was being used by members of CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and others to prepare a coup against that government. He exposed it at the time in a book that he wrote, I believe that came out in 1996. And then when the second Iraq war was about to start, he played a role in attempting to tell people there are no weapons of mass destruction. This war is a fake. This is a fraud. You have to consider that over 1 million people died in that war, and there has been no attempt, and will be no attempt, at least in the short term, to bring war crimes charges against George W. Bush or any of the other members of the United States military or others that conducted that fraud and knowing fraud. That isn't about to happen. But Ritter found himself in a conversation with Judge Napolitano, Andrew Napolitano, who's a fairly well-known blogger and interviewer. And he talked a little bit about this Dugina assassination with Scott Ritter. We want to play you a bit of that discussion, and then I have another. We'll come back and continue from where we've left off.
Why would the Ukrainians ratchet up the war by killing somebody whose father was in Putin's circle? What did the Ukrainians gain by this?
Well, I believe the target was Alexander Dugin, that the daughter was a tragic accident. The car that was targeted, he was supposed to drive, and at the last second, he opted to drive another car. So his daughter went behind this wheel. He was driving right behind her when the explosion took place. He saw his daughter die. Right. Why hit Dugan? Look,
he's a philosopher. He's not a military guy.
Right. Well, I'm an American historian, and I'm on the same blacklist now, death list that he is. We need to understand that the blacklist that we've been mocking, and I've belittled it a little bit. It's a death list, and I warned people about this. I said this takes it takes the Ukrainians just 1 second to shift over to kill people. When they call you an information terrorist, when they say that because you speak your mind, you deserve to be arrested and prosecuted as a war criminal, it's a death sentence. And we saw them execute a death sentence on Alexander Dugin.
Okay, but Ukraine is in a war it is destined to lose. It is losing. Why would it animate Putin to do the same, killing civilians in Ukraine?
Well, no, here's the thing. The reason why I think MI6 was involved is because MI6, British Secret Intelligence Service, does do this kind of black information operation. I think there's universal recognition that Ukraine right now, if something doesn't change, Ukraine is going to lose this war and lose it badly. What they need to do is change the algorithm, get the Russians to do something they otherwise wouldn't do. And you do that by provoking Russia. You do that, for instance, by attacking Crimean air bases. You do that by attacking Russian cities. You do that by assassinating Putin's brain. The goal is to get the Russians to deviate from the plan of action that they currently are implementing and do something that changes the dynamic. And the Ukrainians are hoping that that dynamic is changed in a way that is detrimental to Russia, beneficial to Ukraine.
Okay.
So what we're going to do, I'm going to ask Harley to respond to that, but I'll also just indicate that we will, after Harley responds, go to a special presentation by Lyndon LaRouche. And I have to say, prepared for today. And it's from September of 1999. And it's a discussion of a new strategy for the United States. Now, you might be wondering why and how somebody could 23 years earlier provide you a new strategy for the United States. That has to do with the problem of folly, which is that problems that have gone on and continued in this country of such a nature that solutions that were actually very well provided for the country by people like Lyndon LaRouche have been ignored, but they are standing as what needs to be done, including now. So, Harley, let me just ask you to give whatever comments you wish to in response to what you saw.
Well, I think the most important point that Scott made in that interview with Judge Napolitano was the role of the British. And this is something that most Americans still don't understand. You look at someone like Boris Johnson, for example, who is a buffoon, but he's a buffoon acting on behalf of certain strategic and financial interests. He just did his third trip to Kiev, even though he's going to be out of office soon. And he's more popular in Ukraine by far than he is in Britain. But what's the deal? Why is he going to Ukraine? Why are the British, the head of the British military, telling British servicemen to prepare to deploy for the war? Why are the British, along with the Biden administration, providing the most volume of sophisticated weapons to Ukraine? Since when did the British care about freedom and defending the interests of people, the independence of people? The history of Britain from the time of the American Revolution to today is as a colonial power that uses its military when it has to, but uses other weapons primarily, such as financial control and what today is called hybrid warfare or soft power, that is brainwashing to control populations. So what is this all about? And this goes back to the intersection of intelligence, warfare, and economics. And what Lyndon LaRouche always insisted that we start with is that the interests of the United States, the people of the United States, is not as an imperial power. It's investing in the physical productive capabilities of our own nation, of our own people, and doing that in conjunction with a policy of fair trade with the rest of the world. But the United States was not built on imperial looting, despite the Howard Zinn theory and the 1619 New York Times story and so on. The best moments of the United States were when our American system was adopted by other countries, such as in the end of the 19th century by Germany, France, Japan, and others, which led to a profound existential threat to the British Empire. And they responded with an extended theory of geopolitics, of divide and conquer. And so you look at the British. The British were involved with the United States in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Libyan operation, in the bombing of Yugoslavia in the late 1990s, and so on. So why do they suddenly decide that it's wrong for a country like Russia to get involved in Ukrainian policy? This has to do with the economic issue. The fact that the London-based, Wall Street-based international system is breaking down. It cannot be saved, but they're attempting to ensure that there's no other alternative. And that other alternative is the idea that came out of LaRouche's International Development Bank from the 1970s of a debt reorganization or moratorium and an establishment of credit institutions of sovereign nations which invest in building their own physical economy and work in collaboration on great projects of international development. That's why the British are so intent on using Ukraine to blow up Russia, to weaken Russia. As the defense secretary from Raytheon, Lloyd Austin, said, we are intending to weaken Russia, make them pay bitterly for their actions. But the intention is to stop a new financial system. And that's why we can win this fight, because the rest of the world is moving in that direction. And so what are they left with? They can't beat Russia militarily in Ukraine. Even if NATO actually went into the war physically, the Russians would be able to counter whatever they could throw in there. They can't win that war. What they're trying to do is to silence the opposition to the war, at the same time silence the opposition to the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. And that's what this fight is about. It's really about a future based on science and technology and the development of national institutions of credit, as well as education and science.
Okay, thanks a lot. What we're going to do to introduce the clip we're going to show you from Lyndon LaRouche called A New Strategy for the United States is just reference a lesson that he referenced in a piece he wrote back in 2000, January 2000, called The Issue of Mindset. And he said this: the primary lesson of modern history is that the greatest follies of nations unfold over periods of 1 or 2 generations. There was no great folly in history which was not the ruling opinion of a decade or longer. The greatest follies are the generally accepted delusions which wreak havoc on their believers a generation or so after they have become ruling policy-shaping trends. The greatest follies of all known human history, even before modern times, have been the fruit dropped from a generation or more of stubbornly prevailing trends in official public opinion. There is no greater fool than is usually to be found among those leaders of today's nations who imagine that the utopian delusions of globalism, the induced prejudices peculiar to their generation, are axiomatically the work of a triumphant imperial wisdom. So, the generational and related cycles of true life tragedy of nations unfold. And what LaRouche will now do is to describe to you such a tragedy in the case of the United States.
The world is presently in the final phase of disintegration of a global financial system which was set into motion in the middle of August 1971. From that point on, from the decision made by President Nixon in 1971 to the present time, the U.S. economy has undergone a series of degenerative phase shifts in policymaking and in practice. This degeneration of the U.S. economy also reflects a broader degeneration led by the British Commonwealth, the British monarchy, and other nations who have joined with the so-called Anglo-Americans in imposing upon the world the so-called floating exchange rate monetary system of the period to the present time since 1971. That system is presently hopelessly bankrupt. It will not last. It will disintegrate or it will be shut down. My alternative, rather than letting it disintegrate, is to shut it down. That means that someone with authority must step in, put the old system into bankruptcy reorganization, in the same way you would put a bank in a local community into bankruptcy reorganization, more or less the same, and set in a new system to continue the essential operations, the economic operations performed by the old system, but under new rules and under new management. It is my view, which I've expressed on many occasions, that the only agency which can accomplish this is the presidency of the United States. Not that the President of the United States can dictate such a system to the world at large, but rather without a leading role by the President of the United States, it is most unlikely, perhaps impossible in practice, that other nations would be able to get together with the United States to shut the old system down, put it into bankruptcy, and keep the world economy going, preferably without missing a step, under new management, new rules, and new policies. I've proposed that for some time as a new Bretton Woods system. And let me explain again, which I've done in various articles and so forth, which some of you are familiar with. But let me put it again in this context. We had a workable system from the time that Roosevelt was leading the United States during World War II until approximately 1964, until after the assassination of President John Kennedy. There were many mistakes in the system, but it worked. The system underwent a degenerative transformation from 1964 to 1971, when the old Bretton Woods system was canceled and the new Bretton Woods system, the present one, the so-called floating exchange rate system, was put into effect on the initiative of President Nixon. That former system, the Roosevelt-led system, worked in general. It gave us a world economic recovery, at least in Western Europe and in most of the Americas. It also was beneficial for Japan and beneficial for other parts of the world. This system continued in the form it operated after Roosevelt's death until about 1958. Then the rules began to change. The mud began to slide. There was an attempt to go back to the Roosevelt policies under President Kennedy. Kennedy's assassination was the end of the effort to revive Roosevelt's economic policies. We are now in a situation where the old system has failed, and we desperately need an immediate change to build a new system. In reality of politics, to make such changes under emergency conditions and to make them suddenly, we must rely, at least to a very large degree, on choosing precedents from past history preferably periods of history as close to our own as possible, and use those precedents as guides to design the policy changes we must put into effect to replace the present bankrupt international monetary system with a new one which we urgently need to keep the world economy going. It is my view that throughout the world, only the President of the United States, in his position as President, under our Constitution, has the influence, or the potential influence, and the legal position to be the rallying point for other governments which wish to cooperate in this enterprise, so that the United States government, under the leadership of its President, in cooperation with other governments which desire to cooperate, can set up a new international monetary system, whether the rest of the world wants it or not. We will do it that way with that kind of arrogance because we are acting so that we can survive and so that the majority of the human race can survive. In other words, we will be acting jointly for the general welfare of the world, and those who oppose that must give way. Given the authority and influence, waning as it may be, of the United States, the President of the United States is the one political figure on this planet who could, as they say, pull that off. Now, the principles involved are much older than Roosevelt. But as I said, we go back to Roosevelt in order to find a precedent for policies which we must recognize were successful, in direct contrast to the policies under which we're presently operating, which have been a disaster for about 30 years, a continuing disaster. Look at Roosevelt's policies, and then let's look at them from a standpoint of their historical background and general principles. During World War II, the period of a terrible alliance between a Roosevelt-led United States and a Churchill-led Great Britain, Roosevelt set forth to Winston Churchill and to others very clearly three precise policies, or policy guidelines for the post-war world that the United States would introduce to the world, whether the British monarchy liked it or not. The first thing that Roosevelt specified was that the world was no longer going to tolerate what Roosevelt described as the British 18th century methods. That is, the methods of the British East India Company and Adam Smith, the so-called free trade method. Rather, Roosevelt insisted that because of U.S. power to create this change, the post-war world would be dominated by American methods, the methods which were introduced into the United States officially under the first President George Washington, as typified by the policy papers of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. We were going to make American methods available to the world as a whole. And we were going to scrap the ability of the British to continue to impose their free trade system, their gold standard system, and similar kinds of systems on the world any longer. The second thing that Roosevelt was committed to doing, as he stated explicitly to an irate Churchill, was that with the end of the war, the United States power and the support it would have from around the world would act immediately to eliminate all continuation of Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French imperialism and colonialist methods. That this would be the occasion for setting up, freeing these nations which had been subject to these empires or these types of influences, to become sovereign nation states, enjoying access to the kinds of technology and technological progress which the United States enjoyed and desired to continue to enjoy. And the British would simply have to give up their old system. Thirdly, Roosevelt, pointing to the map of Africa and other parts of the world, emphasized that with the post-war world, the United States would take the leadership using American methods, proven American methods of basic economic infrastructure development and so forth, in order to build up these parts of the world which had been looted, ruined, and kept depressed under British and similar kinds of methods. Parts of Roosevelt's policy were adopted after his death. But with his death, the policy as a whole died. Where President Roosevelt had envisaged the United Nations organization as a way of bringing together nations as a community of principle around the idea of the sovereign nation state, the perfectly sovereign nation state, that such a community of states must be the dominant force and authority on this planet. And the United Nations would be a vehicle to facilitate bringing into being that kind of community of principle of which, for example, Secretary of State and later President John Quincy Adams had written in advising President Monroe to institute the so-called Monroe Doctrine of 1823. That was American policy. But with the president's death, President Truman, under the influence of the British, ordered Japanese troops of a defeated Japan, which were sitting in camps waiting to be shipped back to Japan in Indochina, to come out of the camps, pick up their weapons, and impose French colonial rule on Indochina. The arrangement was that the British would return first to take over, replace the Japanese, and then French troops would come in to replace the British. The same thing was done with the Dutch colonies as present-day Indonesia. The same thing was done with the French colonial empire. The same thing was done with the relics of the Portuguese Empire, a relic which we see in the so-called East Timor issue today. So that part of the policy, Roosevelt's community of principle, was not established. Roosevelt then adopted from Britain a policy, a nuclear weapons policy, designed by a group of people in Britain around Bertrand Russell, perhaps the most evil man of the 20th century. Russell's policy was the policy of the British monarchy. This policy was imposed upon Truman, who on British directives through New York people, such as the Harrimans, who were essentially agents of influence of the British, decided to drop the only two remaining bombs, nuclear bombs in the U.S. arsenal, on the civilian population of an already defeated Japan. Japan had been defeated. MacArthur, aided by the U.S. naval blockade of Japan, had brought Japan to the point that it had no choice but to surrender. It had no possibility of getting the imports on which its economy depended to survive. At the same time, the Emperor of Japan had already agreed through the Vatican to the United States on terms of surrender, which happened to be exactly, more or less, the terms of surrender which Japan accepted after the signing of the surrender agreement. The problem was that a certain section of the Japan military, who had been opponents of the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito, were determined to continue the war. This was the military section of Japan which had launched the Second Sino-Japanese War in China. These were the hardball guys. And the MacArthur policy was sit back, wait until maybe October, until the crunch of the naval blockade brings the Japan military to submit to the will of the emperor who has ordered the surrender of Japan. The British were determined that that should not happen. Therefore, they induced the President of the United States, President Truman, a fool, to drop the only two fission nuclear weapons the United States had on this helpless civilian population of Japan. The function of that was to establish a reign of post-war nuclear terror. The Bertrand Russell nuclear weapons policy which has dominated the United States increasingly since that time to the present time. Most of our military strategy has been a byproduct of that lunatic terrorist policy of nuclear weapons as a way of attempting to bludgeon the world into giving up sovereign nation states and instead accepting some form of world government, something we call today globalization. Give up your sovereign nation state, give up the independence of nations, as Tony Blair demands. Let a rampaging enforcement crowd run around the world on one pretext or another, bomb this nation, bomb that nation, just the same way that Truman bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Bombing helpless populations, destroying economies in order to terrorize nations and the world generally into submitting to this kind of tyrannical will, the will of world government, the will of globalization. So those parts of Roosevelt's policy were destroyed. There was no elimination of the imperial and colonial system. The United States supported Britain in restoring, maintaining, and building up the imperial system, dominated and led from the City of London by the British financial interests. The United States accepted a military policy, nuclear weapons policy, a policy whose sole and stated purpose was to bring about world government and the extinction of all sovereign nation states, including the extinction of the sovereignty of the United States itself. That was the change. Now, at the same time, a compromise was made on the issue of free trade. The United States was the only really functioning economy of that period at the end of the war. Europe was a mess. Britain was a junk heap economically. And the only way in which the world could be rebuilt to some degree was through United States cooperation in setting up a highly regulated system of monetary and financial and trade relations, under which Western Europe, parts of the Americas, and other parts of the world could enjoy an economic recovery. This economic recovery was not truly generalized, but it involved several features which were successful, which we call the old Bretton Woods system, the pre-1959 Bretton Woods system. This involved the replacement of the British gold standard system, which Roosevelt had overthrown in the 1930s for the United States, by a gold reserve system based on a fixed price of gold. This system was backed up by capital controls, exchange controls, financial controls, regulated trade, protectionist methods of trade, tariffs and trade, in order to foster growth and trade among nations. Not the lowest price, not the Adam Smith lowest price. The best example of success of this policy was the case of Germany. After the United States had decided that it was going to support Britain in a nuclear conflict or a potential nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union, it was decided that Germany had to be rebuilt as a bastion, a logistical bastion, for any credible opposition to the Soviet Union. Therefore, the intent to crush the German economy entirely, which had been British and US policy at the end of the war, was abandoned. Under these circumstances, a leading German banker, Hermann Abs, went to the Americans, the remnants of the Roosevelt administration, and so secured agreement to a method for financing reconstruction of Germany. This became known as the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, as proposed by Abs, under which the most efficient use of Marshall Plan credit was made for the growth of economy. That is, the use of Marshall Plan funds in Britain and France were much larger than in Germany, countries whose population was smaller. And yet in Britain and France, the performance with Marshall Plan funds was relatively ridiculous compared to the high degree of success achieved in Germany through the operations centered on Deutsche Bank and the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau. This was a successful system. Obviously, there were many features of it which could have been better, but it was a successful system. Now, while this was happening, and as the economies of the world began to recover during the late 1950s, there was an effort to go back to the free trade system, step by step, to reduce controls, to lessen capital controls, to lessen exchange controls, and to lessen protectionist methods, and to shift toward free trade, the good old British 18th century methods, free trade. The failure of the Eisenhower administration in its second term, the economic failure, created the circumstances under which President Kennedy, who modeled himself largely on the image of Franklin Roosevelt, to become successfully elected as president. While Kennedy may be judged to have been floundered to some degree in getting his feet on the ground in his administration, by the time he was assassinated, he was becoming a fairly serious and capable proposition, as typified by his man-moon landing policy, which is typical of traditional American thinking, which Kennedy showed. The assassination of Kennedy brought that to an end. Effectively, there were remnants of many of us still believed, and as I did, in the legacy of the experience of the 1930s, the war and the post-war reconstruction. But the policy was going down. From about 1966 on, the policy was to march toward the kind of world which Winston Churchill, not American patriots, desired. Henry Kissinger, of course, and so I've cited this a number of times, in an address he gave in London in May 10th of 1982, made reference to this. He said, essentially, he pointed to the fact that the American intellectual tradition and the British intellectual tradition, as typified by Churchill, were at odds. And he emphasized the conflict between Churchill and Roosevelt on the post-war world during the World War II alliance. Kissinger bragging about his contribution to this effort, saying that fortunately, after the death of Roosevelt, British policies had prevailed and Roosevelt's policies had been gradually eliminated. That's what happened. 1971 was the ending of the old Bretton Woods system, was the point at which hell began to break loose. So if we compare the two systems today, we have, especially as Americans, especially as those who are proud of the American Revolution, proud of the Constitution, Americans who were typified by Colonel Malloy Vaughan, a distinguished officer who in retirement continued to serve his country with the same vigilance and vigor as a nation builder, a builder of other nations as well as the United States, a man who recognized that building up other nations as sovereign nation states, as healthy nation states, is in the last analysis the greatest source of security for the United States as a nation in the world. Those of us who recognize the qualified, we make criticisms, Roosevelt, you can make a lot of criticisms. He was a compromiser like most presidents, like most American politicians. He made compromises during the war, which could be criticized. But he did the job. Compromises or not. His system, to the extent that it was continued after the war, for as long as it was continued, worked. We could criticize it. I did criticize it then. I would criticize it today. But it worked. Look at the record. Look at the record of the American system. in his best periods, but look more immediately at the record of what Roosevelt did and what he proposed, what should have been done that was not done. And look at how the rejection of Roosevelt's direction of policymaking led to this global disaster which has gripped this world for 30 years and now brings us to the virtual edge of an apocalypse, both the financial apocalypse and every other kind of an apocalypse.
All right, so Harley, before we go to any questions for you, I presume you may have something to say. Perhaps it's hard after that, but just want to get your reflections on what you've just seen.
Well, in my presentation earlier, I talked about LaRouche's role in shaping a 50-year arc of history. And that presentation was sort of in the middle of that 50-year period, 1999. Over the preceding couple of years, you had a whole series of economic crises which weren't supposed to happen. Remember, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States was considered the sole superpower. And yet you had an Asia crisis, a Russian bond crisis, and then the dot-com bubble popping. And all of these were part of this accelerating disintegration of what replaced the Franklin Roosevelt system after 1971. And, listening to Lynn go through the history of that, there's some of these aspects that after you hear him reminding you of them that, oh yeah, I knew that. But how many people actually understand this as a continuity and understand it as a continuity based on the false axioms that were accepted by virtually everyone? And you see the degeneration of the thinking of a population as these axioms take hold. There used to be Republicans and Democrats who were opposed to the idea of the free market, free trade system of the neoliberals. They hardly exist anymore. There are a handful here and there, but for the most part, that's become a dominant feature. Look on foreign policy. I think one of the most interesting votes in recent period was the 100-0 vote in the Senate to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, what Scott Ritter said in his discussion with Diane Sayre is that what that shows is there are 100 idiots in the U.S. Senate who are ignoring what the U.S. did in the last 20 years in sponsoring and supporting and arming and training terrorists in Syria and elsewhere. So, it's just, I'm always in awe when I hear these old presentations of Lynn, because many of these things I had studied after I heard them discussed by him in the first place. And they're not really fresh, but you get refreshed when you see that this approach that we're fighting for a new Bretton Woods system, a new financial and security architecture, is shaped by battles that have gone on for 50 years, mostly unknown, not just the population, but to the leaders. And now we've got to do a crash course to teach them this history at a moment of profound crisis. So, thanks for putting that piece up in the Manhattan Project today. It's always, as I say, I leave these presentations with a sense of awe and also a sense of satisfaction to know that I made the right decision back in 1972 to dedicate my life to the principles that were reflected in the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche.
We have a question for you from Adam Slawikowski. He has asked this question: can LaRouche's economic insights for social progress make a conscious connection with the working class trade union movement to deal with the energy price crisis?
Now, is he talking about the union movement in the West, or do you?
Yes, I think that's what he means. He's talking, yeah, right, because there's been a certain amount of motion, particularly, of course, in Britain, but it's also a bit more also going on in the transatlantic on many matters, not merely, of course, energy.
Yeah, I think that's something that's going to happen, and it's going to happen because their living standards are under attack. And the discussion LaRouche always had about the problems of pragmatism of the American workforce is that as long as the paycheck was coming in and that it was enough to cover the basics, people were generally content. They could be riled up over an issue here and there, but it's only when you have an accelerating collapse. That's what's happening in the United Kingdom right now. I've been really intrigued by the numbers of people who are communicating with me through Facebook and in response to my daily updates from the United Kingdom. People saying, look, our government is terrible, our policies are terrible, what can we do? And you also look at the farmers in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Spain, and Italy, truck drivers. You look at the situation facing nurses in the United States, teachers. So there are many situations where working people have been suffering basically quietly for quite a while. And after COVID now, we're in a situation where the potential for meetings to take place again should happen. And I think one of the things we have to do is look at the broader, the institutions that represent populations that have a chance to do something. These include trade unions. And I think working people on the whole, when you're left with a situation where you can't afford food for your children, you can't afford medicine for yourself or for your parents, when you can't afford education, when everything is going out of control, you can't even afford the money to pay for your gas to get to work. These are the moments where people are starting to look for ideas. And our job is to be there. And one of the best examples of this is the two campaigns we have in the United States right now, the Joel DeJean campaign for Congress in Houston, and especially the Diane Sare campaign for Senate in New York, where people are looking for leadership, and especially the New York case, where Diane is running against Chuck Schumer. There's no more clear differentiation than that. And so I think the point that LaRouche always made is don't go for a small agreement, or what he was talking about with Roosevelt, compromises. Present the full program. If you don't have money to pay for food for your children, if you don't have a decent job, the problem is not going to be solved on a local basis. We have to change the system in exactly the way Lynn was talking about it. And, he used to say, don't think small, fight for it all. And, I think that's the way we have to approach it. And that will inspire people. And that's what we hope to do with the September 10th and 11th conference.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, and I want to just make sure I put one thing in. There's actually sort of three of them. I'll just sort of, the matter is about Trump, the affidavit, the court order. Where are we on this? What does this actually mean? And compare it to the LaRouche case, the raid. It's sort of a generic, sort of four different things. So I think that's really what it is. We want to know.
Well, let's start with the comparison to the LaRouche case. I mean, the most important point is what Lynn always said, which is you have a permanent bureaucracy in the Justice Department, which is rotten. And it's a permanent bureaucracy where your position, your upgrade or your ability to affect policy depends on going along with the rottenness of the permanent bureaucracy. And we've seen this in the FBI. I'm somewhat astounded that you have Republicans who still talk about the professionalism of the FBI. And it may be that there are individual agents who are professionals, but they're working in an institution which is involved in terrorizing the population. The raid against Roger Stone, the raid against Donald Trump were small in comparison to what was done to LaRouche, where you had 300 to 400 armed law enforcement officials, including FBI, including jeeps and tanks and helicopters, with the obvious intent to provoke something that they could use as an excuse to kill LaRouche. Now, the Trump raid was not quite as spectacular, but what was the intent? At least the obvious intent is to stifle debate, to stifle disagreement, opposition. Now, whether you agree with everything in Donald Trump or not, and I don't agree with everything Trump said or did, what I do agree is that he was unfairly targeted by the FBI on the Russiagate case. And that's the line that connects it to the LaRouche case. The idea that we should work with other countries, that we should have friendly relations with Russia, that there's no essential combat situation between us, was what Donald Trump was saying, that we can talk, we can work together, we can use diplomacy. This is what LaRouche was doing, both in his work with the Reagan administration and his work as a private citizen. So what was done to stop that? Kissinger deployed a Get LaRouche task force. Some of the same people who have been part of the anti-Trump movement since Donald Trump started his campaign for president. Now, in terms of the affidavit, until there's more of that, which is released from what I've read, it appears that most of it has been blacked out. You just can't see it yet. I don't think the Attorney General has made the case yet as to why this had to be done. But this is something that hopefully will come out over time. But the optics of it are clear. That if you support an opposition figure, especially one who's clearly outside of the mainstream, then you can be silenced also. And I think that's the most important thing. Now, what I'd like to see President Trump do is identify this permanent bureaucracy, the rottenness of it, talk about the LaRouche case, talk about the Julian Assange case, the case of Snowden, which he didn't do when he had a chance to do it as president, and demonstrate that he's learned a lesson. Because I think that's what has to happen. We need figures of significance to do what Ramsey Clark did in the LaRouche case, to identify the corruption of these institutions. And instead of presenting himself as a victim, I think President Trump really has to identify much more clearly what's involved in this, including the British side, including the financial side. But that's another question altogether. I just think in terms of the obvious point, there's an attempt to silence people and to polarize the nation, and to get people talking about that polarization instead of the corruption of the arms sales and arms distribution into Ukraine, the absolutely flawed so-called anti-inflation plan, the idiocy of Jerome Powell talking about the American people need more pain to fight inflation. What the hell is inflation doing? That's causing a lot of pain. So, I think we've got to focus on the most important issues, and that's to clean out this corruption in the Justice Department and to show the connection of that to these strategic and financial crises.
Okay, so we've got about 3 or 4 more questions, actually. This one is perhaps even from across the pond, Derbyshire, saying, I'm hoping that the British establishment's own downfall will be accelerated now because of their big mistake was to deliberately deindustrialize their own country to keep their own population down. What do you think?
Well, I think that's an absolutely accurate statement. I mean, the idea in the past has always been that the crumbs falling off the table of the imperial viceroys would keep the British people happy. And that you could contain the opposition in various kinds of pre-programmed demonstrations, but never challenge the monarchy. I mean, what is the government of Great Britain? It's a monarchy. It's a hereditary monarchy, which then brings in some civilians into the lordships and the city of London. But it's primarily based on the same system that the American Revolution was fought against. An aristocracy, an oligarchy with all the power, and the idea of democracy being a slogan that has no real meaning. And the parliamentary system is proof of that. What LaRouche was talking about in one of those clips about the presidential system, that's one of the great advantages of the American system, that a president has the power to set an agenda above parties. Whereas in the British system, it's controlled through parties and very, very much phony opposition. Now, what is happening, though, is that the fact that people are looking at a very terrible winter of limited electricity, limited heating, food problems, food shortages, the inflation is killing the standard of living. Well, this is an opportunity for those who oppose the idea of the British monarchy to step forward. And, I think the lesson of Brexit should be that if you're going to do something, do it all the way. The Brexit really was, it was just another step of playing within the rules of the game. And I think the lesson for the people of Great Britain is break the rules of the game, because the rules of the game are set up to keep you as servants and pawns of an oligarchy. And that same oligarchy is responsible for the rules of the game that are now dominating US politics. So one thing that was always clear about Lynn is he was not a great admirer of rules of the game. In fact, he advocated breaking them at every opportunity. And I think that's the lesson for the people of the United Kingdom.
Okay, next question is from Patricia. Can a mass return to classical education help this nation, or is it too late? And who even knows what that is now? That's what she says. I think
there's an interesting debate, because on my update yesterday, I brought that up. And one person said, oh, classical culture, that's just Western. And then someone wrote a really interesting response saying, no, there are all kinds of classical cultures. What is it that characterizes classical culture? It's a commitment to developing the creative power of the individual and combining that with a love of mankind. That's the whole point of classical culture. It's not a system or a form. When people talk about the Baroque form, then the classical form, then the Romantic form, that at some point in the 1820s, people suddenly said, the classics are too constrained. We now have to go to Romanticism. This is the bunk that's destroying classical culture. The idea of classical culture is not the formal system, but what's embodied by the mental creative activity of the creator that inspires and actually affects the mind of the listener or the viewer. And the idea that if you want to change the education system, go back to the classical tradition where you study, not just in music or art, but in the sciences as well, the original discoveries. What was involved in them? What was in the mind of the composer, as we can ascertain, when they composed a piece of music. And in the case of someone like Mozart, you can see in a relatively short, compact period of time, especially around his relationship with Joseph Haydn and the string quartet, you can see the development of a form of musical presentation in a string quartet that advanced dramatically in a period of less than a decade. From the Haydn quartets, the Opus 20, through Mozart's so-called Haydn quartets, the 6 quartets he wrote for the salon of Baron von Swieten. You can look at something like that and see how Mozart was progressing in his ability to communicate an idea through an interaction, a dynamic interaction of 4 voices. So someone who studies that, or even who just listens to it seriously, will be very different than someone who's sitting there texting while they're in classroom to see if they can get likes on how they look today. So, I mean, clearly we have to fight for the classical tradition. And this is something Lynn wrote about a lot. And it's also something that's been taken up by Helga Zepp-LaRouche and the Schiller Institute, initially through the English language publication of Fidelio, the German publication Ibicus, and now we have a new cultural magazine available that people should subscribe to, because we want to engage people in this kind of discussion of what is classical culture and how do you develop the creative character and loving character of a population.
All right. So we have actually 2 questions. They're both from organizers, and I'm going to read both of them because they're dealing with the same thing, and it's a good, because you'll see what it is. Okay. So Anastasia says, I'm getting some frightening responses from people in this political situation, which is understandable. Now, my tendency is to organize someone to think through the danger and the potential of right now. In your experience, how do you recommend mobilizing people through their fears? And then another organizer asks, when the enemy uses tactics like assassinations and blackmail, what does that really mean? Wouldn't that mean we're actually winning? They have to resort to means of just straight killing people to stop their opposition. Does that show that we have a greater power over them, and does that show their impotence?
Well, the second question, not necessarily, because if you don't have a capability of addressing the problem, getting a lot of people killed is not a solution. Lynn always talked about something that he called factitious advantage, which is that if you identify who it is who's out to get you and why, and make it clear, including if you know the names of the people involved, and get that out widely, you create a situation where if they choose to act, they're going to be identified very quickly. And so you move away from being a victim into being someone who's in the open and forcing them to act in the open. And I think, the question of how do you inspire people to do that, it is the case that when these kinds of threats come up, the intent is to chill the process, to have a chilling effect on discussion, to convince people it's not worth it to wage this fight. It's better to suffer, to submit and suffer, than to risk your life. Well, history is changed by people who don't think that way, by people who think that the important thing in one's life is to act in such a way that you will not be intimidated or turned away from the truth. And the individual who stands up in the face of these kinds of threats provides not just an image of courage, but actually an inspiration to others. Now, the basic point is, what are we facing? We're facing the danger of nuclear annihilation. I mean, you have to get people into the big picture instead of the small. The terror works when you become convinced that the few good things you have in your life will be lost if you speak out publicly. And instead of recognizing that what's important in a life is to act for the common good, the greatest good. And what that means in a situation like this is you stand up to the bullies. You tell the truth. You show that you're not going to be intimidated. And you do that because you look at the alternative. If we're silent today at the brink of a possible nuclear confrontation with Russia and with China over Taiwan, If we don't speak out while we still have an opportunity, then what will be rained down on the human race are horrors much worse than an individual being attacked and slandered and threatened and even killed by an enemy in order to force the acceptance of their policy. So you have to look at it from that bigger standpoint. And that's why the study of universal history is so important. And that's why LaRouche has always emphasized that. So I think if you internalize that you have a mission in life that is why you're doing what you're doing, then it can help fortify you when you have to face the fear that you don't know if there are people out there who care if something is done to you.
All right, so now we have a comment. And I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to read as much of it as possible. Mainly because, Harley, I think this addresses some things that are out there in general that people think. And it probably gives a good chance to give some clarity to what it is we're actually doing, about which I want to make sure we have some time to have you say a few things. So this is from Oswaldo, okay? And it says, it is clear that the money printing families feel endangered by the development of countries. I guess that means Russia, China, India, so on, and have been using their monetary power to infiltrate all world governments and institutions with bankruptcy in order to generate a worldwide bankruptcy reorganization. Got that? So they're trying to get to bankruptcy. The main objective is to impose upon the whole world a bloody green Marxist dictatorship that they think is the only way to obtain worldwide happiness, where everyone will have nothing and be happy, which means obliterating private initiative and individual liberty. LaRouche has been requesting bankruptcy reorganization, but he has said nothing about taking down the money printing demonic empire and all the crowd that controls government. It's hard to read it. Just says, he quotes Alexander Hamilton saying, the natural cure for an ill administration in a popular representative constitution is a change of men. I hold that this new man should be either Christian or from a Confucian culture to displace the Masonic oriented ideology that of people that believe in a Marxist paradise. Get that? Okay, he says he's a Catholic. In our year 2000 year tradition, I maintain the whole world should be organized under Christ. Goes on like that. Money printers should be degraded. Sovereignty should be taken back. So forth. Each nation should strive toward a constitutionality in the direction of the American system under God and apply its political principles that will provide man with a good and happy earthly life, so on. Please comment specifically on the substitution of central banks with governmental, partially owned, private regulatory national banking. Okay, so he wants a specific thing around getting rid of the central banks, replacing it with national banks.
Well, I'm not sure why he thinks that Lyndon LaRouche isn't for taking power away from the evil monetarists who control the financial system. I mean, that's been a central feature of what we've been proposing. But it's not just a question of a Jacobin uprising and going out and hanging bankers. You know, what's at stake here is billions of lives, and you have to do this in a way that's organized, an organized bankruptcy reorganization in which you protect the people who are the most vulnerable, while you, in a sense, impose the punishment to those who created the system, the ones who benefit from it. I mean, a perfect example of this was LaRouche's Homeowner and Bank Protection Act to address the 2008 mortgage crisis. What he basically said is that you're going to have to set up something that will protect the savings and deposits of the average person in the banking system, but put the financial institutions themselves, the investment banks in particular, through a reorganization where they have to eat their own losses and not get bailed out. Now, if that were done properly in 2008, the leading banks would have been shrunken dramatically. Many of the bankers probably would have been brought up on charges, because much of what was done with the buildup of the mortgage bubble was either illegal or at least verging on illegal. But the system as a whole was protected and saved. And what LaRouche was saying is, go back to Glass-Steagall, to the banking regulation where you separate investment banks and commercial banks. No investment bank will ever again be bailed out. People who engage in fraudulent practices will be put through a legal proceeding for that. The money that they have will be part of the restitution for people who have been looted by these banks. All of that was the proposal that he had in 2008. Now, today, if you go with the new Bretton Woods, you start with the 4 laws of LaRouche. And the first law is return to banking regulation, Glass-Steagall. The second law is national banking, and the idea of national banking instead of central banks. Central banks are not government organizations. They're privately owned institutions that act on behalf of government to monetize debt, to sell the treasuries, the bonds, and so on, to raise money for the government. But it actually raises money for the banks. Now, because they get a cut in every sale they make. If you go to a national banking system, the whole function of credit is to start up physical production. Find the entrepreneurs, find the inventors, find the scientists, find the industrialists, fund the farmers, fund the people making improvements in communities to the infrastructure. And that will be based on a bank which is its credit is determined by the Congress. That implies that we have to have a whole different Congress, one that understands Hamiltonian banking. But I would recommend that the person with the question go back through writings by LaRouche and about LaRouche's 4 laws to get a sense of that, and then take a look at the volume of work we've done at the Executive Intelligence Review on Hamiltonian credit. And I think it'll become clear that LaRouche was talking about taking power out of the hands of the existing oligarchs and putting it under a system in which the people determine where the credit goes. And it's done through the banking system, but it's done on the basis of the importance of increasing productivity through improvements in the physical production process.
Okay, we have a question from Yoshi, and the questioner states, Kissinger is a war criminal and should be held accountable for all his murders / attempted murders. How do we respond to what he's saying now?
Well, since I don't know Kissinger, but I know that he's had a devious life for 99 years, or at least probably the last 85 of them. Maybe he's thinking about meeting his maker. But even when he speaks against the policy of provoking a war with Russia, he still does it within the framework of the system of the balance of power and realpolitik, which is the hallmark of his work since his book, A World Restored, about the Congress of Vienna. So, the fact that Kissinger said something that's useful, we should note, as we have, but it doesn't mean we're becoming Kissingerians or defenders of him. He has a long career of, as the questioner points out, of carrying out mass murder, both through the wars he supported and also through his adoption of the National Security Study Memo 200, which was an attack on population growth in mostly developing sector countries. So I think Kissinger is a war criminal. If I were to say what war criminals should be prosecuted, I'd instead look to the ones who are still active, people like Tony Blair, as a more important target. but it is important for people to note that Kissinger played a role in some of the most heinous crimes of the second half of the 20th century.
I think what we should do, Harley, this is a little bit different than normal. I'm normally, what would happen is I just say, okay, thanks, and then I would do some summary. But because of the nature of the battle we find ourselves in, the fact that it's 2 weeks before this conference, and that people know about this issue of this Ukrainian hit list, kill list, and we're doing things and things are happening around it, I'm going to do something a little bit different. What I'm going to do is to do the summary that I would normally do, partially because I want to answer the question that was just asked, and then see if you have a response to it, because even if we can't discuss much more today about this might be something that we would want to devote, if not a program to, a discussion, a later discussion to, maybe even next week. And this is what I want to take up. The issue of Schiller, or at least the idea of the Schiller Institute and of tragedy. Because fundamentally, the actual issue is that people have a wrong conception of tragedy. The conception of tragedy that people have is the one from Friedrich Nietzsche. And I'm not going to try to say what Nietzsche said or any of that, but let me give you this example. I referenced Napoleon at the beginning of the show, and I want to just return to this. When Napoleon invaded Russia, starting in June of 1812, he was, of course, convinced, since he was Napoleon, of course, he intended to be convinced of his own invincibility. And he took this army, which really only had about 100,000, 150,000 real troops, and it had sort of this horde of hangers-on, some of them mercenaries, some of them just soldiers of fortune, sort of people like Falstaff, for example, and Henry V, or Henry IV, Part 1 and 2 in particular. And these people all went to war. And what happened was that he arrived in Moscow after a series of battles. He did, in fact, defeat, his armies defeated portions of the Russian command. And they got there into Moscow on September 14th. Now, when he got there, he was expecting Tsar Alexander I, for whom he had disdain, great disdain, to meet him, or at least his representatives to meet him, to offer terms of surrender. To give you the sense of his disdain for Alexander, he made famous remark to his wife, "If Alexander I were a woman, he would be my mistress." So that's what he thought of the emperor of the Tsar of Russia. So what happened was, he was not greeted with any delegation. In fact, when he came to the city, there was great silence. And his troops noticed that the city had been largely cleaned out of most of what you could carry. Sometime late that night, a fire broke out, and then by the next morning, there were fires all over the city. And there were various booby traps of ovens and other devices in some of the houses that caught fire when you walked in, or you tried to use them. So Napoleon stayed there in Moscow for about a month. And sometime around about October 18th, 19th, as the snows just began to fall, he began to dimly realize what had actually happened. And then he had to retreat out of there, and his 600,000 person army would be annihilated, not only by the opposing Russian force, because he didn't know that something had happened, which was that in May, before he had begun his attack, Tsar Alexander had gotten in touch, they'd been in touch with the Prussian Reform Movement. This was a group of people who, after their own defeat at the hands of Napoleon, had been able to get the power to reform the military and the educational system of Prussia. And it was Karl Freiherr von Stein who led that. What happened was that von Stein was contacted by Alexander I and asked to come to Moscow. Along with him, others came to Russia. Gerhard von Scharnhorst, August Gneisenau, and Karl von Clausewitz. All of these were military officers and theoreticians of war. Clausewitz, of course, became as famous for his treatise on war. But they were all called part of what was called the Alexander Regiment. sometimes also the first emperor Alexander Guard's grenadiers. Now, what happened was these people advised Napoleon and Napoleon's general staff based on their own experience, but it wasn't just military experience. One of the keys to their briefings, key to their outlook, was their own study of Friedrich Schiller's works on history. That's right. Friedrich Schiller, the poet, sometimes called the poet of freedom, author of the Ode to Joy, was by profession an historian. He was also a trained doctor. And his works on tragedy, not merely plays like Wallenstein and so on, but his history, such as the history of the 30 Years' War, informed the way that they thought of how the military command could be organized to defeat Napoleon. Because the issue, of course, is to understand the inside of the mind of one's enemy. I'm going through this because this concept, Schiller's concept, particularly of tragedy, is an advance over Shakespeare. It's a very specific approach that he takes. And this is not the time to talk about that per se, but rather to talk about the application of this as it featured in military command. This was not the first time in history this was done. This is the same thing that the Greeks did. In fact, the invention of Greek tragedy between, well, let's say the practice of Greek tragedy, rather, between the years 500 and 490 BC, was specifically directed toward preparing the Athenians. Remember, there's no Greece, they're all city-states. It was to prepare the Athenians for the eventual battle with the Persians that they knew they were going to have because of the 2 decades prior set of battles with Persia that had been happening on the west coast of Turkey, where the Ionian city-state colonies were. A lot of people had fled from there, and they'd come to Athens, they'd come to Greece, and everybody was clear that at some point the Persians were going to invade. The problem was how to prepare the population for a form of liberation war which would be victorious, not merely a good college try. And so Aeschylus, the dramatist Aeschylus and others, developed Greek tragedy as a way of portraying to the Greeks, to the Athenians, their flaws, but on stage, so that they could work out by watching these flaws, one of which, by the way, most importantly, was their fear of and belief in the gods of Olympus, which really represented more the oligarchy of the time, including the Persian oligarchy in its own way. So anyway, the point of this is that it was the ability to take drama and to take classical principles of drama and to show not, quote, the flaws in individuals, because that's the difference. The belief today, which is a Nietzschean belief, is that tragedy is about the flaws of individuals. And so that's why you'll get, for example, whether you're talking about the Me Too movement or some of the Black Lives Matter people or some of the other people that attack Western civilization all the time, it's always about this guy is a racist, this guy is a womanizer, this guy is a pedophile, this guy. There's never a facing of the fact that the fundamental problem in tragedy is that the so-called leaders are not different than the population. That's the tragedy. It's when the leaders try to act like the population that the society collapses. The tragedy is in the people and it is embedded in the people, not because the people are inherently evil, but because the master-slave dynamic that is characteristic of oligarchical forms of government in particular, but it's also, for example, equally true in democracies which practice the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of public opinion, the going along to get along, the tyranny of mediocrity. You have situations in which people are not able to rise above that. Now, Lyndon LaRouche was in this respect, absolutely fanatically committed to a visceral opposition to that form of banality and going along to get along. Today, what's needed in terms of our own moment at this time, when you look at this issue of, these attacks, some people are getting, quote, scared. I mean, the reason they get scared because these people are obviously serious about killing people and so on. But what are they really? They are what occurred 100 years ago in Germany, in Italy, differently in Japan and also in the United States. They are a form of fascist movement. But what is that? It's an abandonment of the idea of perfection that was characteristic of the best of Renaissances in many other cultures, all kinds of cultures. Western culture, of course, has in a very specific way the notion of the sacredness of human life, but more importantly, the powers of the mind to be perfected and the need for public education as a full-scale commitment to every citizen, along with the fundamental rights of housing and food, shelter. These things because we are trying to build independent, sovereign citizens of a republic, not a democracy. Yes, there is a democratic practice within the republic, but the concept is that the citizen is capable of assuming powers and tasks because they have prepared themselves to do that. And so the citizen soldiers of Athens went out and defeated the Persian horde. They were themselves, by the way, not professional military people. Virtually none of the soldiers of Athens that fought on the plain of Marathon were actually professional soldiers, unlike, for example, the immortals of the Persians. But the Persians represented a horde, just like Napoleon's army represented a horde. And Republican-minded people who think about their own independence are always superior to that. That's what we as a movement, as a society, have to bring back into currency, it seems to me. And I wanted to say that because clearly Harley's on the blacklist. Diane's on the blacklist, the so-called blacklist. But again, Kissinger's also on the list. And so it gets interesting, doesn't it? Why? What is it? Well, really what it is that it's time that a tragic trend that LaRouche talked about, and you just have been presented with by him, be reversed. And that tragic trend is that individuals like him are required to change the circumstance we find ourselves in. And the purpose of the Schiller Institute or of the LaRouche organization or of other associations with which we've either founded or been involved in is to allow such individuals to come to the fore and play the role that's needed in history. So Harley, I wanted to say that with you on and see if there's any response you have either on the cultural question or on the blacklist, and in terms of the next weeks in particular as we go into this conference and as we continue to smoke out and expose what this operation is.
Well, I'm glad you said what you did, because this whole question of how you avert tragedy is not something that's a simple do number 1, 2, 3, connect the dots. It really does require a change in thinking, but we can't wait for everyone to have a change in thinking. And so there are a couple of things I would say that are important just in terms of what we need to do immediately. And then we can take up this question of developing a hunger for the tragic imagination. What the Greeks did and what Schiller did was address in the population this question of wanting to be better. How do you get people to want to overcome their fears so they can be better? That's a longer term process, but I think the immediate question is we need to get an outpouring into the Congress of anger that the U.S. Congress is not only going along with these kinds of threats, including to American citizens, but funding it. So, we have on our website a letter that was signed by myself and others. We have 2 or 3 other things that are available that we've taken letters to heads of committees and to a number of congressmen. And you can find that on the Schiller Institute website and join our mobilization. That's this question of factitious advantage. Let the would-be killers know that they will be known if they proceed the way they seem to be intending to proceed. And that's something that anybody can do. So I would start with that, and then I would recommend again the next issue of the Executive Intelligence Review we'll have a longer article on what this is all about, including why we're absolutely right in saying that there are Nazis and neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian security forces who are being armed and aided by our U.S. government and the Western governments in NATO, and that people need to speak out against that. Let your congressman know, your parliamentarian know that you're not going to accept that anymore. That's not acceptable in the so-called democracies. So there is some work to be done, and then work with us to build the conference on the 10th and the 11th. This will be the opportunity that individuals will have to participate in a discussion of how we move to a new security and financial architecture, taking power away from those who are the ones dictating the terms of surrender for the world's population.
Okay, I don't know whether we have the letter that Harley referred to. Do we haven't have the graphic of that? If we do, we can put that up. And if not, what I want to do is just, was one last question that got asked by one of the previous people, which is, well, how come Kissinger has not yet been held accountable and for his crimes? And I'll say this: that is entirely because the case of Lyndon LaRouche has never become the dominantly well-known case of political harassment in the country. Now we can do that now. We can do it now precisely because of what happened with Mar-a-Lago and so on, and because of our independence, both of that process and our having come first. In other words, the LaRouche case is 36 years before Mar-a-Lago, and it's 10 times the size in terms of what was done. And we didn't just survive it, but there's another element. It was initiated and largely at the request of Henry Kissinger. Now, he's not the first one to request it. British intelligence actually did it first, about 30 days, 40 days before he did. But what happened was that that case has never been exposed in terms of the public knowing it in such a fashion that the crime that was committed by multiple agencies of government, and for that matter, international intelligence agencies, ever came to the fore. It's something that Ramsey Clark talked about, the former Attorney General of the United States, who testified to a tribunal back in 1995 about that case. And Ramsey Clark was eloquent in terms of how he talked about that case being he put, as he put it, a broader range of deliberate and systematic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge. Now, that was initiated by Kissinger. So he's on the same kill list as Harley. So now we have a circumstance in which, talking about this issue of tragedy, you see what we mean by having this higher conception of the solution to tragedy. We don't intend that to just have, well, if these people try something, you're going to know that it's going to be the other way around. We're going to make sure that these people are not only known, but that their capability of doing what they're talking about doing is taken from them. Because in other words, the thing should be dismantled in the same way that people are talking about doing that with respect to the FBI or other institutions. The only way to do that is that you have to awaken the light of citizenship in the minds of the American people. Most of the American people are subjects. They are not citizens. They do not take responsibility for their nation, and they do not think that they are to take responsibility for that nation other than perhaps by voting. That is not only inadequate, it is criminal to do that in a circumstance in which the nation itself is being usurped in such a way that it threatens the livelihood of people all over the world, and it turns us into our own worst enemy. So, what I want to thank Harley for being with us. I think it probably will conclude at this point, Harley, and urge that everybody be with us, of course, next week, which is the week before we have the Schiller Institute conference. If you want to get in touch with us to help on the campaign around the blacklist, you have ways to contact us. We put it right down there in the bottom of the screen to the LaRouche organization, of course, and also individual blogs and so on. Yes. Or you say questions at LaRoucheOrganization.com. Contact us there, and we'll direct you as to what you can do with us. And so we want to thank everybody for being with us today. And we urge that you, like we, go out into the world with the vigorous conception of the science of victory, with every intention that makes sure that truth knocks out the brains of falsehood. Okay, good afternoon.